As has been described, this webinar is divided into two parts. It's all about strategies for success. The first part is really around strategies for a successful research, outcomes, publications. And the second session is more looking at how you progress your accounting academic career. So the first session, Robert Faff is going to present on pitching your research. After Robert's presentation of around 15 to 20 minutes, Robert and I will engage in some Q&A dialogue between the two of us. And then, of course, we will turn our attention to questions that may be coming through the Q&A portal of the Zoom meeting. So with that, I will now gladly hand over to Robert to talk about pitching your research. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Keryn. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this fantastic event. Online is the way of the future, and I'd love to be there in person, but maybe that's for another time. I really appreciate the support of UGM. This is a fantastic initiative. I don't have long. This is going to be a taste test today. So first of all, I'm going to start. I don't normally do it this way, but in the interest of time, I'm going to start with a video now. We need technology on our side. I'm optimizing the screen so the audio and the visuals should work, but Keryn is going to tell me if there's any problem. I have plan B up my sleeve. So hopefully now, Keryn, you could confirm that you see a lovely cartoon character on the screen.
Hi, I'm Robert Faff, Professor of Finance at the University of Queensland Business School. You'll come to know me as the Pitch Doctor. Researchers make systematic and rigorous inquiry into things. It is immensely rewarding and important work, but definitely not easy. New researchers often have trouble getting started, maintaining focus in a sea of information. Supervisors are there to help, but their time is limited. Wouldn't it be great to have a systematic method for keeping yourself on track and getting the most out of the time you have with your supervisor? For more information on the pitch template, go to the SSRN and access the latest version of pitching research at the following web address. And also the web portal, pitchmyresearch.com.
My time is gone. I've got some slides.
Robert, you might need, Robert, can you just stop sharing your screen in the video?
Yeah, so these slides are far too long for today's purposes, but I've provided a Dropbox link that can be circulated, and anyone that wishes to access a slide, you're very welcome. I just want to cherry pick a couple of things, and then I'll stop and we can start with the chat that Keryn had mentioned earlier. So hopefully you can see the big purple screen, a quick taste of pitching research. Can you see that, Keryn?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, right. So this is really a quick taste. What I'd recommend, and I believe quite a number of you have done the homework, the pre-homework, pre-reading, but for those of you that haven't, I really urge you to access the paper directly from SSRN. It's freely available, it's very simple to do, and you get a record, basically a written record of all the advice, all the blood, sweat and tears from my side. So as I said, these slides will be available. You can get that address. It's pretty simple to find. If you Google my name, my last name, Faff, and SSRN, it's pretty much the first thing that you'll get. So I'd recommend that strongly. And normally I have 3 goals for the slides. We don't have time for all the 3, but I'm just going to slip through. And this one, you know, it's all about communication. Well, at least it's one really strong way of getting the message across to you of what this is about. It's more than that, but you want to communicate your ideas to a mentor to get their feedback and get their advice. And the biggest mistake you can make is to give them too much information, because they just won't have the time to read it properly. At least that's my experience. So you're trying to communicate with an academic expert. And it's a really tough thing to do. My argument would be this framework allows you to have more success. It's like part of your strategy. The framework's very simple. You saw the cartoon character go through essentially all the items on the left-hand side of this screen. There are 11 items: working title, basic research question, key papers, motivation puzzle, idea data tools, what's new, so what, contribution, and other considerations. So one thing I wanted to quickly emphasise and reinforce is within the framework, deceptively simple, in my view, is sub-packaging of items designed to help you. So the first package is the first package of 4. And for me, the advice and the argument to you is to view this as the opportunity for you to frame or set the big picture of your research. And this framing, this contextualization, is around two aspects, 2 dimensions. It's what is this broad area about and why are people interested in it? And a critical element of this, but it's not the only element, is the motivation. And with the motivation, it's a combination of first setting out what is currently known in this broad field. So what are the things we know? And that is then a great foundation stone for shining a light on the things that we don't know and that we need to know. And that motivates the big picture. From there on, the template drills down to your research. This is a plan for your research. So moving or transitioning from the 4 items to the next 3 items. And these are the project-specific basic building blocks. And they're trying to hit at 2 things, 2 dimensions. Mainly it's about how, and it's a little bit about what. And the what comes through in the idea. And I often say, well, if you're in an area, so an area of accounting where the tradition is to make a prediction or a hypothesis, that's going to be the core of the idea. And that's the core of what. Now, we need more than just what. We need to know how you're going to go about doing it. And that's the data and the tools. And mixed together, those are the building blocks. And you should, as a package, be able to convince someone, irrespective of the other elements, that you are heading in the right track. But you don't necessarily head in the right track just relying on those building blocks. How else can we get a compass, a sort of guide, a navigation for that we are heading in the right direction? Well, the next 2 items are a package of 2 that really try and help us in another, from another perspective. The 2 key questions. And these 2 key questions are about why. Why is it worthwhile doing this research? It has to be new and novel, what's new, and it has to be important to someone. It has to be important, well, primarily to the academic community that you want to engage with. Now, if we have one of these but not the other, I would argue to you, you may well have quite a reasonable paper, but if you have both and you think about both right at the beginning and keep an eye on them, you're going to have a better paper in the end. Now, the icing on the cake in terms of why is the bottom line. It's the single dimensional challenge of contribution. What is the incremental contribution that you hope to make to this field of study? How will knowledge advance? How will we understand the world better? In accounting, we have particular an accounting lens of the way in which we want to see a better world that accounting can help facilitate. So the contribution is going to be contextualized and calibrated from that accounting point of view. And then there are other considerations, and I go into quite a bit of detail on those in the SSRN paper. Now, pretty much I'm going to finish on this slide picking out a few themes. I will probably quickly tell you something about the rest of the slides if you access them, just so you know how to deal with them. But a lot of the themes which we've already got from the the cartoon that you've seen, the 9-minute animation, as well as a few things that I've said now. Well, the emphasis is on being succinct, because one of the biggest mistakes that I have seen in 35 years, and I've made all of the mistakes, including this one, is to essentially drown someone with too many words, too many pages. So the framework basically says you've got 2 pages, 1,000 words. We want to communicate to an academic expert. We want to start a conversation. Now, the communication is both written and oral. And I guess one piece of advice is don't aim for perfection, at least perfection too soon, probably perfection ever, but that's a debatable thing. The point about this is if you aim for perfection too soon, you're very likely to change what your ideas are, and then you've overinvested. I know our time is basically up, but there's a whole bunch of slides here that go into advice, and I'm just flicking through them around each of the dimensions. Possibly some of the questions I'll get will allow us to flick back to these. And then there are examples. So there is a non-accounting example that I think you'll find very interesting. So there's a link here you can click and watch a YouTube video. And then at the end of the slides, there are a bunch of resources that I point you to. With that, I will stop and hand back to Keryn. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. And so if you stop sharing your screen, I'm just going to use the next 5 minutes or so of time asking Robert some questions, and then we'll turn to your questions in the Q&A. You've sort of seen a brief snapshot of the pitching document. It's something that I certainly use with HDR students, and also actually undergraduate bachelor students that are doing research projects as well. And I think the other way you can use it, Rob, not about your own ideas and sort of crafting it, but you can also use the pitching template to help students synthesize the literature that they're diving into, almost use it as a template for critiquing literature as well. But my first question is that, you know, you're well known internationally for your empirical work in finance. What about qualitative researchers? I'm sure we've got some participants in this webinar. Does the pitching template apply equally for qualitative research?
Thanks, Keryn. I've had that question many times before, and so I'm a quantitative researcher, and I've always been honest along the way. Particularly early on, I was very nervous about saying, I think the very early time, 5 years ago, I would say, this only applies to quantitative. And I think in one of those very early sessions, a qualitative researcher in the audience said, well, actually, I think this will work for qualitative. And to cut a long story short, I think it does work. Probably the areas where you have to be a little careful around idea, data, and tools, you often have to have a broader perspective of how you apply those. So with the idea, you're probably thinking more in qualitative that theory has to play a role. So theory doesn't get an explicit mention in this framework, but it can go in there. Data will be different. So you have qualitative data. You have to think about, you know, the meaningful things you can say there around interviews, etc. And then how you're going to analyse them. You need the tool. So is it going to be LexiMancer or something else? So the short answer is yes, it does work. And there are examples that I could point you to show you qualitative cases.
Okay. And you just touched on the theory. And you know, often we talk about the need for a theoretical underpinning. Where does the theory fit into the pitching template? You know, where does it go?
Look, I definitely see it will come in a little bit and should be brought in when talking about the idea. For those that are in areas where hypotheses or predictions are the norm, and it's not always the case for accounting, and qualitative is actually a good example. But, you know, to get a credible hypothesis or prediction, you really need theoretical foundations. So I think it can come in there, but I wanted to leave it more implicit, because I think when people see theory, the temptation is to want to write a lot. So, you know, if you have an area where agency theory is important, then you can just use labels. I mean, as an initial communication device, the labels will work. Now, I also see a potential role for theory coming in the motivation. I talk in the SSRN paper about the puzzle and also the tension, and so you can get theoretical tension. So if there is a genuine theoretical tension, you can draw attention to that, but again, concisely. And in terms of a puzzle, the sort of abstract but real example that I think of there is thinking about the theory on one side and how that might match or not match what we see out in the real world. So we observe auditors, for example, and they do various things. The textbook tells us they should be doing these other things. Is there some sort of puzzle that we can use to motivate our study? So again, theory could come in there. It could also come in a few other places, but I think that's a pretty reasonable flavour for your question.
Okay, and perhaps a couple more questions before we turn it over to the webinar participants. The pitching is very much sort of around pitching to the academic community. What about other stakeholders?
Yeah, look, I started thinking about that a few years ago, and the short answer is I'm pleased to say, teaming up with a couple of colleagues here at UQ that aren't in accounting or finance. In fact, a key collaborator was a professor called Tim Castell in innovation, and basically we've teamed up to produce a supplementary tool that has a lot of flavour of the one that you've just seen, and it's got a whole bunch of things to think about if you've got a topic that you believe is really relevant to stakeholders, and it's the engagement and impact sort of thing. So indeed, one of the elements of that framework, that engagement and impact framework, is to say, well, who are the stakeholders? I mean, who's the main stakeholder? What's their interest in this area, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's one way of answering it. I mean, the other is the stakeholders can naturally fit within the framework that I've already given you, and I could see them mostly coming through in terms of the motivation. I mean, I emphasise the academic motivation, but I think in some of the practical research that we do, that there's going to be both an academic motivation and a more practical one. So again, I think the stakeholders could enter there quite naturally.
Mm-hmm. And one last question from me, and let's, particularly for people participating on this webinar, we've followed the template, we've executed the research, and we get insignificant results. What would be your advice to our early career researchers and HDR students?
Well, after you've cried for a little bit, so it's only a half joke. I mean, I think we do get a little despondent about that, and it's one of the big risks. And in fact, it's one of the things I talk about as another consideration. Try and anticipate, but we don't have crystal balls, so there's no guarantee that you could do a pilot study. So you try and do things that get you into a safer zone. I mean, it's a big problem with the way that the current research setting, because, and it's another topic completely, and I'd be happy, in terms of responsible science and responsible research, I've got a really good session that I could give, and it talks about all the cocktail or confluence of things that we face, incentives, etc., that can induce poor or bad research behaviour. So one recommendation is not to be too tempted to go down the dark path of, if you're a quantitative researcher, to p-hack, which is basically to say, I've got insignificant results, this is terrible, journal editors will only like it if I've got significant results, how can I get significant results? And you tinker with the data, you tinker with the tools. Now, this happens all the time, and everyone would recognise, to an extent, it's okay, and over a line, and I believe, many people cross that line and don't fall for that temptation. But early in our careers, it's a big temptation. So, it's a super important question. It's really hard to give a short answer. And I'd be happy to talk on those issues on another occasion.
Okay, well, we've allowed around 10, 15 minutes for questions from participants. So perhaps if I hand over and we see what questions may be coming through. So, Rob, there's a question there. If I want to make a more complicated research idea, for example, for my PhD dissertation, so I have to use the same template or maybe more complicated template?
Look, my strong advice is don't complicate it. So you got to adapt it. So one way, we'd have to know more details of what complication. But let's say the complication is you've got 3 essays. So this is a model. I don't know whether it's popular in Indonesia, but in finance and in some areas of accounting, you do 3 essays on under an umbrella topic. And so that will complicate it because you got 3 times the number of things, even though there's a common theme. What I've said to my students is just do it 3 times because we can have 3 conversations. They're likely to be sequential. Now, if it's not that, it's just complicated research idea. Well, let me help give you an insight in a secret. Everyone has complicated research. All right. So I don't know who So yours isn't the only complicated one. Every single person has complicated research. The trick is to be able to figure out, at least early on, how to convey the most important aspects and to essentially take out the extra complications so that it's still conveying enough of you're not oversimplifying it so it becomes trivial. So I'm not saying trivialize it, but this is a real skill. And the skill is to figure out what are the main things. Sure, it's complicated and run with those. And then as it develops, you can get into the complications. Now, what I see happening in this type of situation comes through, the diagnostics that I would pick out is when I look at the working title. The working title's like four lines long and it's got 7 moving parts because it's complicated. Well, that's a really bad strategy. No one wants to see that and be confronted by that. Or the research question. You have 4 research questions or 5 research questions, or you have 7 hypotheses because it's complicated. Very bad strategy. You've got to get your ideas and thoughts down to what are the main things, cover those off with the mentor that you want advice from, and then it can unfold.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
Right, I think I can read this. The question, if I want to make the next one.
Contribution.
How tells us whether the research proposal will make a contribution or not. Everyone knows a contribution is important, but basically no one is confident to ever say, there's no magic formula. And there are good reasons for that, including to actually be able to articulate and pinpoint the contribution takes a lot of experience and takes a lot of detailed knowledge about an area. So, the bottom line is what you've got to strive for is to be able to articulate what the essential message is that links to knowledge creation. We're trying to create knowledge, and it will naturally link to 2 other items in the template. The novelty and so what. So that knowledge creation, new knowledge is always going to be seen as better than just a rehash of old knowledge. So that makes sense. It's also got to have an importance. So it makes sense that both of those probably have something to do with contribution. Now, my argument is that's fine. They will overlap. but I get a little depressed when I have students who, to me, probably are a little lazy and they just copy paste one of their answers for those. And so the challenge is here, well, there's a couple of related challenges. One is to recognise, well, they're probably two things that have a big link to contribution. Look at what you've written for both of those and now try and bring them together in a single statement around contribution rather than just repeating. Now, the second thing is that is more narrow focused around what your research is about per se. Those papers that really make a big contribution are the ones that give a platform for new knowledge creation downstream and beyond what the study narrowly does. So another way of putting what I'm saying now is, if you find that all you can say about contribution is somewhat a repetition of what's new, so what, to me that signals that you don't have a great, you have an okay contribution, but it's not as good as it could be. The studies that have fantastic contribution go further than that. And they're the ones historically that we see, the best examples are those that seed a new direction in the research literature. Now, that is super challenging, but that's what we should aspire and strive for.
Rob, if I can just add to that, and I think you've given the lovely expose around the intersection between the contribution, the novelty, the so what's new.
Yep.
It's not uncommon to sometimes see, particularly amongst high degree by research students as they're starting off, that this notion that, well, this is what I'm going to do because it hasn't been done before. And that always poses the question that I would ask back, well, maybe it hasn't been done because it's not interesting. It hasn't got any of those factors. So I guess what I'm suggesting is just because something hasn't been done doesn't mean it's worthy to be done. And hence the importance of the template around the contribution, the novelty, the so what, the what's new. We have another question here around using the template for literature review research. I'll ask Rob to talk about this, but this sort of captures a comment that I made around I actually find it's a useful tool for students to actually do their literature critique. So as they read an article, to use a modified version of the template to actually ground their critique of a particular article. And then you've built up your critiques in a common format. But Rob, you may have different thoughts or use it differently.
Look, I largely agree with you. I suppose one way to think of it is, I emphasise the 3 key papers. For many of us, that's too limiting. So what you could do is have some sort of stage process. So I think for at least, at a minimum, those 3 key papers, you could apply the template as it is, reverse engineered. Now, I think for a slightly bigger set, and, it's up to you to judge how big a set, whether it's, another 2, or you might go to 10 if you really find there's a lot of pretty important papers, then it might still justify using the full-on template as I've described. Beyond that, I think you get diminishing returns because as you get a bigger and bigger set of papers that, you're reading, but naturally they become less and less important. And that's where I agree with you, Keryn, that you could then have a modified version where you're not stressing yourself out to come up with answers to every single aspect. So you get to choose, well, which ones would you be thinking about for those less important papers, and you go with those. So that would be the sort of way I would use as a literature review, critiquing type of tool. I think it can work very well there, and you just have to apply common sense and don't view it that it's all or nothing. Definitely.
Okay, and I see there's a couple more questions, and so perhaps we'll try and squeeze them in our last couple of minutes. We're writing our template, and we find that there's a lack of data. Well, I guess that's one of the beauties of doing this template. But Robert, should we change the topic or change the sample or just use available data? There's quite a bit of quite a bit in that question.
Well, there is. But as you say, this is one of the reasons why you force yourself to think of this early as possible. How many times have we, all academics that have been around for a while, and you would have seen it, Keryn, I've seen it, where the student, that hasn't been thought about early enough. And so you invest these months of your life thinking about everything else, and then you ask the question, the data, and there's a key variable you can't get reasonable data on. That's a disaster. So what do you do about it? Well, you'd recognise that there's a problem as soon as you can, and then, there's no simple answer, but it's a conversation to have with an experienced researcher. And in some cases, it might be a slight pivot in your research. In other cases, it's a U-turn. But at an early stage, a U-turn is not a big problem. If you're in the first few weeks, there's no big heartache. 6 months down the track and you've read all this literature, much of which might now be not as important or relevant, that's verging on a disaster. We want to avoid the disasters. It's about the feasibility.
And the last question, what should we do if there's other researchers researching the same topic? And to me, this hinges on the same topic. So, often it's been stated that you can always differentiate your research, even if it's in the same area. And that differentiation can come through different means. But Rob, what would your pearls of wisdom be in response to this?
Yeah, so this is one that I pick up in the other considerations. And I think we should think about it as early as we can and as often as we can, and keep an eye on what's happening. We can always be blindsided. I've seen cases where, with the greatest care of looking at the competitor risk, there's competitors. This is why some researchers keep things secret, because they want to, they don't want anyone to find out. Then they put it on SSRN. It's a developed paper, and you go, wow, or it's forthcoming in the accounting review or whatever. So it's just being vigilant, hoping for a bit of luck. As you say, there's nothing wrong with a few, and it's quite a healthy sign that in an area where there's not, there's an overlap of the way in which you're attacking a similar research question, but it's just trying to make a judgment on how competitive are you and how close are you to what they're doing. If you're too close, that's a warning sign. And if they're too competitive, and a classic case is where leaders in the field, so, the key papers are going to be by leaders in the field. They should be by leaders in the field. That's where you should be looking to see the competition. They're the real competition, because they will very likely, if you've got a good idea that is induced by reading their papers, guess what? They probably have a very similar idea. So you want to see what they have as working papers, what they are giving at conferences, and maybe one strategy is, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, depends on who you are, what background you've got and skills, etc. You might be able to collaborate with them, particularly if you can get in early enough and say, hey, I've got this idea, I want to work on it, this is very similar to your paper. Trust is important. There are all sorts of war stories we hear about ideas that have been stolen, and I think sometimes that's probably close to the truth, and other times there's a misunderstanding. Why? Because an old saying I remember from a long, long time ago, there is nothing new under the sun, and just because you have an idea doesn't mean someone else and many others in a fertile area have very similar ideas simultaneously. It happens all the time. So you might think your idea is stolen, but it's not actually the case.
And when there's those few sentences that may appear in a published paper around, future research opportunities, that probably means that set of authors or sort of other author teams that they're part of have already actually executed the piece of work around that potentially. So
It could be. I mean, you need to be a bit careful because, you know, sometimes it can indicate they've looked at it, but they know it doesn't work, and that's why they're willing to offer it. And something even more devious, they haven't looked at it, but they're pretty sure it's not that great an idea, or it's probably not going to work, and they're, you know, I wouldn't put it past some to spread a few, you know, a bit of noise for those that might be sniffing around, and so you get people working on something else while you're working on nothing. Hopefully that doesn't happen too often, but yeah, I do agree with you.
Okay. All right, we've run out of time, and I know we need a bit of a break before we start our next session, which is around academic career progression. So thank you so much, Robert, for being with us and talking about pitching your research. Do we have Jayne in the webinar? Oh, excellent.
You can see me? Excellent.
Oh, that's wonderful. So yes, what we've just done in the first session is talking about pitching your research. This particular session is actually focusing on career progression. And I guess it's very timely because at the moment, certainly in Australian institutions, this is the promotion cycle time. So I know my task over the weekend, because I sit on our university's promotion committee for lecturer and senior lecturer, is to read through and review and evaluate all of the applications from across the university. So it's with great pleasure that I run this session with Jayne Godfrey. Jayne has a distinguished academic career as an accounting researcher and scholar. She's held roles such as the Dean of the Auckland Business School, University of Auckland. She's also been the Dean at the College of Business and Economics at the Australian National University. She's been President of the Academic Board at Monash University. Jayne's also been a member of the Australian Accounting Standards Board, also a member of Australia's National Accounting, Water Accounting Standards Board. And other positions that Jayne's held include President of the Accounting and Finance Association of Australia and New Zealand. She's been a Divisional President of CPA Australia and a member of National Committees of CPA Australia, and also been on the Regional Council of what was the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Australia. So in this session, I guess we're going to engage in a bit of barter. We're going to be asking each other questions that typically we would get as people that have been heads of departments of accounting and also as deans of business school from academics who are seeking to work their way through the promotions process. So the first question that I'm going to ask Jayne is, each institution has its own approach to promotions, but typically there's commonalities, just as there's also points of differences. A brief synopsis of what are those commonalities and what are the differences that we see certainly in the Australian and other environments we've been associated with.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really good question, and I think that it's a multidimensional question as well. Thanks, Keryn. When I think about promotions and similarities, I guess I really think I try to categorize that into three different aspects. One of those is the process, one's the criteria that are applied, and another is, in fact, the level of performance. And you'll find commonalities there, and of course, I think we've probably both seen some differences as well. So when it comes to the process, always a written application, and it's supposed to be as objective as possible and also legible, or something that that everybody on the promotions panel can read, not necessarily written to someone who's an expert in the individual's particular discipline. Referee reports, always required, and I think we'll probably talk a little bit later about how you might choose your referee, for instance, or referees. And also some institutions, and when I say referees, I'm talking about people nominated by the applicant, and they will be nominated usually to cover a range of criteria. Other institutions will also require assessors, and I know that I've served on a number of assessor panels or promotion committees as an assessor, and I dare say you and our colleagues have as well. And as an assessor, you are not nominated by the applicant. You're actually nominated by the institution, who seeks someone who has expertise in the particular discipline to provide some evidence of international comparability, if you will. And I've certainly been involved with a couple of Malaysian institutions in relation to that. So that's part of the process. There's inevitably an interview, but in fact I've been on some promotion panels. In fact, I've even chaired one or two where we haven't interviewed the candidates, and sometimes candidates have choice to be interviewed, sometimes they don't. So that's really a large part about the process. In terms of the criteria, we're only talking about universities, so we are talking about academic excellence, but what constitutes academic excellence? That's going to vary across levels, and hence my comment earlier about not just the process and the criteria, but also level of performance. And of course, it becomes more onerous or more national and then international as you progress through the ranks. In terms of the criteria, research is always there, as is teaching, as is service. But they can vary enormously depending on the types of roles. So you might, for example, be in an institution and be applying for an education-focused role, in which case the research that you would be looking to demonstrate would probably be related to education in the discipline, more so than disciplinary knowledge. But inevitably, the three are required, and institutions will sometimes allow you to specialise, but sometimes not. I don't know whether that's the same as your experience, particularly at Swinburne, for instance.
Yeah, so maybe if I can just come in on the criteria, I think you know what many institutions in Australia have is they have quantitative criteria, and that may be around, for example, teaching evaluations. And now what we typically see is we also see criteria around research expectations, whether that relate to publication quality. I think it's around quality now rather than quantity, and perhaps it's also built around research income, but also now we're seeing a lot more of impact coming into the criteria as well. And that probably is something that we'll talk about as we progress through this session, you know, what measures exist for impact. But one of the variations is, while there may be criteria, often where that's pitched is different. So, you know, I've been at institutions where the criteria in terms of the quantitative criteria is actually aimed at the aspirational level. So it doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, that you've got to be hitting those aspirations, because they are aspirational. Or is it a floor level? You've got to at least be hitting this minimum to be eligible to join. So each institution has their own variations, and that's going to be a function of how they measure a reward and how they also dovetail this into workload. The other thing that I'll just comment on is the weighting. Some institutions give applicants the opportunity to weight their portfolios that Jayne talked about in terms of, you know, the research, the teaching and learning, and the service. And sometimes I've seen that weighting relate to well, what's been their workload allocation as an average over the past 3 years. And some don't necessarily weight because it comes through the defined roles that an institution may have, such as Jayne mentioned, they may have dedicated education-focused roles or teaching-only roles. So, yeah, there's similarities, but there's also points of difference. And I guess assuming someone is in a teaching and research role, rather than a research only or a teaching intensive. My next question, Jayne, is, which sort of is continuing that vein, is do you have to have significant achievements given the level that you're applying for in terms of the three portfolios?
And the answer to that will depend on the institution, and that's where there are some real differences. So you mentioned, I mentioned to begin with that you'll always find all three to some degree, and as you said, they maybe have different weightings, and you might be allowed to choose your weightings. Certainly, at one institution where I worked, you were required to demonstrate a level of achievement across all three, but the level of achievement could vary depending on which you specified as your specializations, and also the weighting. So the weighting and the level could vary, but inevitably there would be a limit to, you would not be allowed, for example, to be promoted without achieving at a particular level. 20% with a 20% weighting would be the absolute minimum, for example, in research or perhaps in teaching. And the idea, of course, is that we really want scholars who are going to not only achieve themselves, but also bring others along with them. So the service aspect, for instance, is important. Does that get to your question in part?
Yes.
There, Keryn?
Yes, I think so. And the other thing that I will add is that certainly at the institution I'm at the moment, for a teaching and research academic, you need to have significant achievements in at least 2 portfolios, but that doesn't mean a third portfolio can't have nothing. You've got to be deemed to have at least be operating at the minimum expected level for that particular portfolio. So perhaps if we get a little bit more specific now in terms of some strategies for the webinar participants, you know, often in our positions, Jayne, we have staff members that will come to us asking for our support because they advise us of their intention to go for promotion. I don't know about you, but I have a standard response to that. Perhaps I'll ask you how you would respond in the first instance.
Okay, I guess the first things I really ask are about whether they really do tick all of the boxes that are required, and in a sustained manner. And I know that we've talked about this before as well, because promotion is inevitably for people who are achieving at a sustained level. And one of the things I think that's important too to recognise, certainly from every institution where I've worked, the requirements for promotion are that you achieve already at the level to which you are being promoted, and that you can demonstrate that that level of achievement. So does the person really think that they are already performing at that level, and do they believe that they can convince other people that they have? Then I usually ask, well, show me your CV. And that's as an objective measure as you can get before someone starts on preparing an application, because I think it's a waste of time preparing an application if there is no case. So take a look at the most objective measure and check whether it actually covers all aspects that will be required. And I usually then give a fairly honest assessment of what's in front of me, but also ask the person if they're prepared for that next step, because sometimes it requires taking responsibilities that take them away from the program, from the path that they've already been taking, and needing, for example, to demonstrate responsibility for managing other people, for leadership, for instance. And are they really prepared for that? And I always ask the question, what if you don't achieve this promotion? What's the cost of that to you? And everyone says, that's fine, I have to prepare this anyway, it's costless. Well, it's not. And people can become very disappointed and very embittered. And so I think it's really important that that people in our positions and anyone who's advising someone about promotion, that they really consider the impact should the person not achieve the promotion, because sometimes they don't. And you don't want to lose someone, and you don't want them feeling that you have advised them inappropriately. So I think it's important to be honest. I'd be interested to know what your first thought is, though.
Look, not that different, but one of the things that I do ask anyone to do is I say, okay, I'll initially have a view on whether I think they're ready or not. And then I will ask them to say, okay, you go away, and what I would like you to send me is a one-pager of tell me what your top 3 significant achievements are that you would write about in a promotion application for each of the 3 portfolios. And I think that can be very insightful, because your application is about showcasing your significant achievements. And so what comes through in terms of just some 3 dot points, a couple of sentences around those significant achievements in each of the 3 portfolios can be very insightful in getting the applicant themselves to think about, well, what have I done? And particularly around the sustained performance, because a good 1 year isn't going to convince a promotion committee that the performance is sustained. But so, yeah, that's typically what I would ask. And then the conversation would continue based on what those 3 achievements look like. Perhaps if I can ask a question, Jayne, we've got people in the webinar that will be wondering, well, is there a typical career progression timeline?
And I've certainly heard people say that there is, and I haven't met many people who fitted it. I think that's a really tough question, and what concerns me sometimes is people erring at either end in terms of longevity. In other words, thinking that because someone has been at a particular level for many years, it's time for them to be promoted. Well, that's not really what it's about. Promotion is really going to another level where a higher level of performance is expected of the individual and they should be achieving it. It's also about giving to others perhaps more than is necessarily required sometimes at a more junior level. So I think that that's a danger. It's really important to look to the criteria rather than just someone's been around for long enough. At the other end of the spectrum, and I've certainly been on panels where usually I'm the one who's arguing that someone has actually not necessarily been in academia for a long time, but relative to the opportunities, they have done incredibly well. They've demonstrated that they're performing at the level to which they're applying, and that they would be fantastic at that level. Sometimes to be met with, but they've only been a senior lecturer for 2 years. Why would they go to an associate professor? The answer is really, what are we trying to promote? We're promoting on the basis of achievement, sustained performance, and really the ability of the person to perform at that level. And that's not necessarily age dependent, nor it will have something to do with time. The question is how many years, and that's really depending on individuals' own performances and aptitudes. So I've got pretty strong views on that, and I think you probably do as well.
Yes,
no, they fit.
Yes, of course they fit. A couple of extra things I'll add, that when you're going for promotion, typically it's what the panel or committee will be looking at. What have you done since your last promotion or since you were appointed to your current level? So you can't sort of draw on things that got you the current appointment, or necessarily draw on things that were based on your last promotion application. The only thing there that may become relevant is if you can show impact. So particularly in a research sense, if there's research impact coming through from earlier work that wasn't there previously. But I think there's a couple of other things that came out in Jayne's answer that, time permitting in questions, we'll come back to. And that's about relative to opportunity. Most of the Australian institutions, as part of the promotion application process, will always have the ability for an applicant to talk about their relative to opportunity. And the second thing that it caused me to think about too, to raise if we have time, is what the research tends to tell us about people and when they time their promotion applications. And the research actually has shown us that women tend to wait longer and men tend to go earlier. So that's why you see a number of intervention strategies or support strategies that have been in place now in Australian universities for a number of years to actually support particularly women through the promotion process. And I'm talking about programs such as SWAN programs, strong mentor programs, but maybe that will come up in our questions. If we get a little bit more specific now, and questions that maybe people on the webinar would like to know an answer to. Jayne, and we'll talk here about our research portfolio. Quality versus quantity. Is it best to publish a lot in your career or aim high for 1 or 2 top quality publications?
Well, it's not really a binary choice, is it? Because I would argue that the best aim is to publish a lot in high quality journals. But that's a really tricky question, and I think because people have very different views, and I certainly have colleagues, we both have colleagues who would argue you don't aim for anything but the top journals. I also know editors of some top journals who despair of the fact that they receive lots of submissions from particular universities, and those submissions are not high quality and are always rejected, and it's clearly reflecting the advice that academics have received. My personal view, and it's the approach that I took myself, is that when you're a very junior academic, it's not easy to get into top journals, and I think it's good. Perhaps I'm demonstrating one of the features that you mentioned before, that as a woman I tended to look for a bit of a confidence boost to begin with and aim to publish something. Aim for the best journal that I think that you think that it will get into, absolutely, but don't waste it because it's not going to get into the top journal. It takes years to get into things like the Accounting Review or AOS or other top journals, for example, in our disciplines, and in fact that goes across the board for all of the business disciplines. So my usual argument is that someone should try to have something to demonstrate that they can publish, give themselves a confidence boost in the process, aim for as high as you think it is reasonable, and seek advice from people who know, and then improve the quality as much as possible along the way. And if you've got an amazing piece of work out of your PhD, for example, by all means, aim for a top journal. So I'm not saying just aim for a lot of publications, which might help you feel good and certainly pads out the CV, but ultimately it doesn't stand you in good stead if you haven't achieved at the level and the standard that you could. So I guess that's my complex answer to the question, Keryn.
Thank you. And I think the other thing to note, particularly for the accounting discipline, and this will also depend on the process that applies at particular institutions. So if, for example, your university, your promotions panel is a university promotions panel, it means that you will have people on that panel from diverse disciplines assessing, for example, an accounting application. So what becomes important is to contextualize your research achievements as well. And it sort of links into the quality quantity, because, you know, accounting, we know roughly how many A-stars journals we have, and that can be very different to the number of what would be perceived as A-star journals in other disciplines. You know, we can talk about rejection rates. So the contextualization is also important when you think about this. What about now?
Can I jump in there? Sorry, just for a moment. You've
Sure.
reminded me that one of the things that I do advise people to do in terms of the written application is to always provide an indicator of the quality of the journals and this goes from lecturer through to full professor, because if you don't, someone on the panel is going to do it. And if you can save people time, you're actually bringing them on board as well. But it's an important thing to be able to do. The other thing that I recommend is that if someone's going for appointment, or sorry, for promotion to a particular level, and you know that the panel is not going to be completely familiar with all of the quality measures, or the volumetric measures for that matter, quantitative measures, to provide something of a benchmarking table where you can indicate the identity, or perhaps not, but at least say person X at this particular institution was promoted to, let's say, associate professor or senior lecturer with this many publications, of which A were in A-star journals, B journals, or C journals, or whatever as the case may be. And that provides some really good contextualization. And if you can put it in a table, it's so easy to read and incontrovertible.
Okay, so if we have a look at the teaching and learning portfolio now, and here's another question that some of you may be thinking about. So Jayne, is it wise to just keep your teaching humming along, you know, getting good evaluations, or is it important to be innovative? And of course, often with innovation comes, you know, we talk about innovation, we talk about it's okay to fail. So that may mean poor teaching evaluations. And that could affect, therefore, your performance appraisals. What would be your response there? What would you sooner?
I think it's important always to try to be innovative, to do the best job that you can. Now, yes, we do understand the bit about it's all right to fail. We say that. But then when we look at applications and we see poor teaching evaluations, we always ask why. And that's where I think it's really important to make sure that you demonstrate a sustained level of performance and you can explain an aberration. So, for example, this was the year that we introduced Innovation X. The students really didn't like it. As a consequence, we went back, we revised the way we dealt with it, and that demonstrates that you really are thinking about your teaching. It's not just something that's being done because you have to do it, and that you're you're reflecting, and that's viewed really positively. So I've been on quite a few promotions panels where inevitably someone has provided their sequence of teaching evaluations, and the comment is made, well, it was pretty poor in this particular year. And you go back, well, yes, but as they've explained, this is the reason for it. And it comes back to the circumstances, I guess, really too, in terms of relative to opportunity, particularly if someone has been asked to take on a particular approach to teaching, for example. Changing to online would be a great example of that. I think there'll be a lot of assessments in future, coming right up now, about how people have been able to manage that and understanding that it's not so straightforward. Does that?
Yeah, so I think there was a key word there that you mentioned that I always look for, and that's reflection. So I'm interested in an application that is reflective. So someone can talk about, you know, what they've been doing, the innovations they've made, and reflect on that. And, you know, you're if you're a AACSB accredited school, it's all about continuous improvement. And so that same mindset is applied to an individual's teaching. And I personally have in some staff that have wanted to innovate, but they've been very concerned about, well, gee, how will this impact my teaching evaluations? I've actually documented in writing that I have requested and given, my absolute support for this innovation to occur. And maybe that's quite a significant change. I'm thinking, even maybe something like a totally different delivery model. And I will say that this will, the expectation is, because it's so different for students, that there may be a negative reaction, but this will be recognised. So I think that's important, that we can give people the confidence to innovate, knowing that it won't severely impact them. Of course, if it doesn't work out, what I would expect to see is, well, why didn't it work out? How can we tweak this or tweak that? What changes do we make the next year that suddenly see a tick up? In our time that's permitting, I'm going to ask one question about service and leadership, and then one other question, and then turn it over to the Q&As that may be coming through. A question around the service and leadership portfolio. sometimes I get asked, people want to put up their hands for a role because they need that role because it will help them in their promotion application. And of course, my response to that is, well, there's only so many roles to go round. So you have to think more broadly about how you can demonstrate service and leadership. Jayne, how can people demonstrate service and leadership without having a designated role?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting, actually. You made the comment that people seek to go on committees and the like because they think it will get them promoted. There is a downside to that as well, and that is that the expectations are for active participation on those committees. It's not just be on a committee and put that down, because inevitably the questions will be asked. Fine. There are opportunities sometimes to be on multiple committees, and people just don't bother turning up to the meetings, or if they do, they are completely passive in that. So I think there are two sides to this issue. One is when there's an overabundance, perhaps, and the other when there's not. But I think what we're really looking for with leadership is someone demonstrating that they are prepared to lead from the front. They are actually prepared to step out of their own situation, and it might be that they're leading through teaching innovations. You don't have to be a senior person to take leadership in terms of change, and it's certainly appreciated by senior people when they have that real input. Being involved with student bodies, for example, and demonstrating that you can mentor those students in extracurricular activities so that you're actually taking a role there. Being engaged with the profession, being part of their organisational structure and contributing. You don't always have to be a senior person for that to work at all. So I think there are ways. It's not always that easy, and particularly, for example, I think about situations where you might have a very small department in a faculty. For example, if it's a faculty of business that has a small commercial law department, for instance. People demonstrate through various means, and you have to be innovative in that regard as well. So it's about people leadership as well as official positions.
Thank you. Yes, and if you think back to the previous session we had where we talked about contribution, in a research piece of academic work, the question that I would always ask someone if they leadership, service roles, they just list their roles, is I'm not interested in what roles you've had. I'm interested in your contribution that you've made while you've been in those roles. And that's what I want to see you talk about. One last question, as then I hope that the questions from the audience will be ready. We've probably both been in institutions where there's been performance development or performance management systems. Some work better than others. What do you see the link between the performance development system that operates at a university and the promotions process?
That's a really interesting question, because certainly everywhere I've worked, the performance management system is separate from the promotions system, and you've not been so let me start again. A head of department, for example, has not been permitted, or a supervisor has not been permitted to disclose what's occurring in the performance management process. It's regarded as highly confidential. On the other hand, the applicant can disclose that. And I think that it's actually important to do so, because I actually think, what's the point of performance management or performance management processes if it's not to assist someone with their career and of course achieving the institution's goals. So I think it's important that that an applicant for promotion should be able to say, these are the goals that we have set, and here is my performance against those goals, and to do that voluntarily, not relying on their supervisor to say that. So that addresses a confidentiality aspect, but also demonstrates that someone's prepared to say these are the things that I've acknowledged I needed to work on particularly, and here's how I have. And that goes back to the reflection comment that you made earlier too, Keryn, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Does Swinburne have a bifurcation in terms of the processes here?
Yes, and I'm very much for a system whereby people should be able to load up or know that they're participating actively in a performance development or management process as part of the promotion process. Because if you've got the right system in place, the messaging that an individual should be getting from their performance management / development process should be informing them around the timeline for thinking about their promotion application as well. But yes, often they're two separate systems. But with that, let's use the rest of our time to see what questions we may have from participants. And if there's not questions coming through, I'm sure we can keep asking each other questions. Okay, so the first question there, I think I don't know much about this governing thing, but I think the question is talking about that devotion, education and research. To me sounds like it's the portfolios that Jayne and I have been speaking about, you know, your research portfolio, your education or teaching and learning portfolio, and your service and leadership portfolio. So yes, it's the same in Australia. You know, that's what we are expected to do when we're appointed to a teaching and research academic position. We are expected to make contributions across those three portfolios. Of course, the extent, you know, you may have more weighting on one portfolio than the other, but the expectation is there's performance across all three, unless, as occurs in some institutions in Australia, you're in a research only role. And then the teaching and learning or the education portfolio, you're not doing any teaching and learning, although some research only do still pick up some teaching and research. Or you're in a teaching only role, which or teaching intensive role, in which case, you know, what you'd expect to see in the research may be very minimal, or maybe it's research around teaching and learning pedagogy, for example. So I hope I've answered that question. Jayne, I'll just hand over to you if you think that interpretation that I've given is the correct answer to Astuti.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I guess another point, as you were speaking, Keryn, I was thinking throughout my own career, I've always tried to blur the boundaries of teaching, research, and service, and hoping that, in fact, I can draw from one to contribute to the other. So teaching, you should be researching presumably in an area where you're teaching, and if you're pushing your students, you will inevitably come up with some issues that are interesting for research purposes, and it's useful to inform your students about the research that's going on, not just your own, but other people's research. So I find teaching actually helps me to be current with my research, because I blur them in that sense. And when it comes to service, you're likely to be using your own research and your teaching to be able to contribute to external parties or to leadership, and supporting people within your own disciplines. So I actually see a lot of overlap. I think what we should be looking for is not how to compartmentalize, but how to develop synergies from one area that will improve the other. It's not always easy, but
the second question there looks like it's talking about sort of your field, I guess. So, for instance, would it be considerable research record if the field is range from auditing information systems to leadership and governance? This is a hard one to answer, but I'll answer with a general proposition first, in that, you know, what you expect someone to be able to elaborate on in their application is, what is your expertise? You know, what are you known for? And I think it's a hard sell to say, I'm known for this and this and this and this and that. So I think, I've certainly commented on applications where it can look opportunistic. If there's, a publication in this area and then a publication in this area and a publication in another totally different area, because I don't think that's building that expertise that is necessary. That said, of course, it depends on what you're contributing. If your expertise is in a particular methodology that lends itself to a range of disciplines, well, you've got to sort of argue that case. But I would be looking for, and it goes back to the question around, I will always ask someone, tell me in your opening statement of your promotion application for research, what are you known for?
I think that's a really good piece of advice, Keryn. We can all be generalists, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to further knowledge, and you can do that better by having the depth within that area, but you need the breadth to begin with. And I guess if I think about my own career, my PhD was in the area of accounting for foreign currency, particularly in consolidated statements. Not exactly everybody's cup of tea. It was easy to develop a niche in that area because nobody else really wanted to teach consolidations nor foreign currency. I'm exaggerating a little, but probably only a little. But I think what I'm getting at here is that it is actually important to try and find something that you can be, where you distinguish yourself, where you are actually not so much noticed, but you can actually make a significant contribution that will lead to your being noticed because you're making that contribution. And perhaps later people become more generalist, because then you'll be able to take that across other areas as well.
All right. Well, perhaps we'll leave it there, except maybe I'll just give you 3 tips for what to do or what not to do when writing a promotion application, and Jayne can do the same. My first tip is, don't sell yourself up or comment on things when there's no evidence to support it. Mm-hmm. The second tip I'd give is, this is about storytelling. All right, your application will be read by people that don't know you necessarily, and so it's very much an art of storytelling. And the third thing is that relates to that, don't assume that people know you and know what you've done, because they don't. So that gets back to the storytelling aspect as well. Jayne, what would be your top 1 or 2 tips?
You stole mine, Keryn. But I guess I think I'm really only expanding a little on one of your points, and that is that you need to make it easy for the promotion panel. They want to promote. Panels usually actually want to promote people rather than reject. So make it easy for them. Address the selection criteria very, very clearly. I have seen people write long essays where research is addressed at the start, in the middle, and at the end. Similarly, education, and similarly, or teaching, and similarly, service. Use the headings that your institution requires. Read. And I hate to say this, but we're not very good at doing what we tell our students to do. Read the question is usually the first thing we tell them about exams. In this case, read the promotion criteria and address those criteria. And if you can't address them, it's not time yet. But address those criteria and then expand as appropriate. So they're the key things I would really say. And also remember that you're writing to people who are not necessarily in your discipline area, and so you need to write for intelligent people, but somebody should read your application before you submit it, and that somebody should not be in your own discipline. Give it to your mum or dad, your spouse, your brother, sister. Do that. That'll help. They'll be honest.
So thank you very much to listening to Jayne and myself today. We hope you can take away one pearl of wisdom from that. And I'd like to thank Jayne for joining me in this discussion. And of course, thank everyone for the opportunity to do so.
Sekarang kita masuk sesi yang sebenarnya saya merasa kecil di hadapan pembicara kita hari ini. Saya lebih kepada fasilitator dan barangkali Bapak Ibu menyebutnya moderator begitu, untuk belajar dari beliau Profesor Mahfud Sholihin, guru besar di Departemen Akuntansi Fakultas Ekonomika dan Bisnis Universitas Gadjah Mada. Tentu ada alasan yang sangat kuat bagi kami untuk mengundang beliau menjadi narasumber pada kesempatan hari ini, karena memang profil beliau yang sangat insightful bagi kita semua. Tentu kita ingin mengeksplor lebih dalam apa yang menjadi pengalaman beliau dan kemudian bisa berbagi pada kita semua. Perkenankan saya menyampaikan profil beliau yang CV-nya cukup panjang, tapi saya ingin menyampaikan hal-hal yang sangat penting meskipun pada waktu yang sangat singkat ini gitu ya. Yang pertama, beliau telah mendapatkan profesornya sejak tahun 2016, cukup muda, apalagi profesor di akuntansi yang kita semua tahu tadi pada penjelasan internasional social science, apalagi accounting itu challenging untuk kemudian bisa salah satu memenuhi kriteria atau requirement untuk berkarir di dunia akademik. Tapi beliau berhasil menyelesaikan karir pada top level sebagai akademisi itu di usia yang relatif muda, kalau nggak salah 43 tahun sudah memperoleh profesorship-nya. Mungkin nanti bisa konfirmasi lebih lanjut. Saat ini beliau Profesor Mahfud Sholihin juga menjadi secara struktur, ya kalau tadi dibicarakan 3 portofolio, ini portofolio selain karir di akademisi yang sangat baik, kemudian juga dari sisi manajerial dan leadership barangkali boleh saya sebutkan 3 posisi saat ini yang beliau emban. Yang pertama menjadi Wakil Dekan Fakultas Ekonomika dan Bisnis Universitas Gadjah Mada, yang kedua menjadi Ketua Dewan Standar Akuntansi Syariah, dan juga yang tidak kalah penting juga menjadi Ketua Ikatan Ahli Ekonomi Indonesia, Ekonomi Islam, cabang Yogyakarta. Sesuatu yang 3 posisi yang sangat strategis di handle oleh beliau. Kemudian riwayat pendidikan S1 Gadjah Mada University, S2 dari top university di Australia, member of yaitu University of Western Australia, dilanjutkan PhD dari University of Bradford, United Kingdom. Kemudian pengalaman penelitian cukup banyak, hibah yang beliau peroleh kalau saya lihat di list di sini sampai dengan 13 hibah sepanjang karir sebagai akademisi, dari yang nilainya barangkali 10 juta sampai Bapak Ibu tahu yang terakhir yang beliau terima adalah penelitian dengan nilai lebih dari 2 miliar. Yang ini saya kira sesuatu yang terbangun sejak lama dan menjadi sesuatu trust yang bisa kemudian diberikan oleh lembaga kepada beliau. Di samping juga berbagai lembaga yang memberikan grant ini adalah lembaga yang prestisius. Kemudian pengabdian rasa masyarakat juga tidak kalah, dalam artian ini sampai juga mendapatkan grant senilai 1,5 miliar dari sisi jumlah yang itu refleksi performance, saya kira. Kemudian dari sisi karir penelitian untuk jurnal, beliau memiliki dari Q1 jurnal dari beberapa nama yang barangkali boleh saya sebutkan: British Accounting Review 2 kali, di sana ada Accounting and Business Research, di sana ada Financial Accountability and Management, di mana semua itu termasuk kategori top jurnal, tidak hanya pada level kemudian sekedar terindeks, tetapi pada kriteria yang top level. Secara kuantiti, kalau boleh saya jumlahkan, karya beliau mencapai 29 karya ilmiah, luar biasa, termasuk mendengar tadi malam beliau mendapatkan 1 tambahan publikasi di Q1 Journal, luar biasa Pak Mahfud Sholihin. Tanpa kemudian memperpanjang penyampaian saya atas profil beliau, mari kita satu lagi yang harus saya sebutkan, national level academic leader di bidang sosial humanitarian. Jadi academic leader berarti top pada level nasional 2019, saya kira ini dari Kemenristek Dikti waktu itu, penghargaan yang diterima menjadi terbaik di dalam karir akademik. Baik, sekarang kita masuk ke dalam sesi tanya jawab. Saya akan menyampaikan beberapa pertanyaan kepada beliau. Beliau akan merespon dan berbagi kepada kita. Selebihnya seperti sesi sebelumnya, Bapak Ibu yang ada di sebagai partisipan mohon menuliskan pertanyaan yang ingin disampaikan kepada beliau sejak pemaparan kami. Nanti akan dibantu untuk ditampilkan sebagai pertanyaan di dalam slide PowerPoint. Pak Mahfud, mendengar apa yang telah disampaikan dalam perspektif internasional, sebenarnya mungkin ada persamaan juga, ada tantangan yang tersendiri yang tadi juga disampaikan oleh salah satu penanya, partisipan di dalam webinar ini. Pak Mahfud mungkin punya pandangan tersendiri mengenai hal itu. Bagaimana karir Pak di Indonesia setelah mendengarkan barangkali perspektif Australia? Akankah sama saja sebenarnya berat, di sana juga berat, di sini juga berat, atau sebenarnya Indonesia lebih berat? Kalaupun lebih berat, apa tips atau saran yang Pak Mahfud bisa berikan? Monggo Pak Mahfud.
Terima kasih Pak Singgih dan Bapak Ibu semua. Pertama, izinkan saya mengucapkan terima kasih kepada M.Sc, lalu Pak Singgih dan juga guru-guru saya yang saya lihat ada yang di sini, lalu sahabat-sahabat saya. Ya, semoga apa yang saya sampaikan bernilai manfaat, bukan sebuah bentuk kesombongan. Nah, itu yang harus saya ingatkan pada diri sendiri. Jadi sejak saya dihubungi Pak Singgih, sebenarnya saya juga bertanya apakah memang sudah layak gitu. Tapi Pak Singgih memotivasi saya. Jadi saya itu sebenarnya juga banyak belajar dari Pak Singgih ya. Jadi Pak Singgih, ya ini sharing aja Pak Mahfud, ya enggak apa-apa. Termasuk yang saya belajar dari Pak Singgih itu research. Nah, research itu saya dulu enggak mau daftar-daftar research itu, tapi Pak Singgih begitu bersemangat tiba dari dikti, kemudian saya belajar dari beliau, akhirnya ya ketagihan gitu ya. Dan karena merasa sudah tenaga sudah berkurang gitu ya. Lalu biasanya saya memang ngajak yang lebih muda sebagai mitra untuk penelitian. Jadi kalau tadi bisa disebut nilainya segitu, ya itu karena dengan teman-teman. Jadi saya melihat silaturahmi itu penting ya untuk membangun sinergi di antara kita. Jadi kolaborasi itu penting. Jadi kalau karir di dunia pendidikan, ya memang unik ya, di Indonesia sering terdengar tridharma gitu ya. Tridharma. Tapi kalau saya malah tambah satu lagi, catur dharma. Termasuk dari takmir masjid barang, ngisi pengajian. Maaf ini pakai peci karena hari Jumat gitu. Ya, jadi memang berat dan yang sering kita dituntut untuk tiga-tiganya jalan gitu ya. Kalau saya set up empat-empatnya harus jalan bersama. Ya itu memang berat. Tetapi seberat apapun Bapak Ibu, kalau menurut saya gitu ya, kalau kita punya passion, lalu kita punya semangat, insya Allah ya Tuhan itu akan menyertai kita. Jadi saya punya cerita yang menarik nih, waktu saya S3 di Bradford, ya salah satu dosen saya, ya saat itu beliau adalah head of department, ya mungkin sebagian Anda tahu yang Prof Rosdani Hanifah itu dia bilang, ya orang Malaysia sih, cuma udah lama di Inggris. Mahfud saya lihat orang Indonesia itu sebenarnya pinter-pinter, tulisannya bagus-bagus, kuantitatifnya kuat gitu ya. Tapi ngapa yang publikasi internasional kok sedikit? Ya, saya sambil guyon, mereka punya pekerjaan lain yang lebih penting, yaitu mengabdi untuk bangsa dan negara, gitu ya, menjadi RT, RW, mungkin. Atau ada juga yang menjadi komisaris, menjadi pejabat, sehingga tidak terlalu perhatian terhadap publikasi. Sambil guyon saya begitulah, masa saya mau ngomong bahasa Inggrisnya nggak baik kan, yo masalah harkat dan martabat bangsa kan ini gitu. Saya bilang gitu, mereka punya kerjaan lain yang lebih penting. Jadi kembali ke pertanyaan Pak Singgih itu memang berat ya, apalagi kalau diminta kan semua itu berjalan itu deh. Pendidikan mengajarnya banyak. Pak Singgih itu sampai sudah seperti profesor itu ya. Sebentar lagi insya Allah profesor juga beliau itu, karena ngajarnya banyak. Tadi malam jam berapa Pak Singgih kita masih komunikasi ya, jam 10 kalau nggak salah masih komunikasi, terus tadi jam 4:30 atau jamnya sudah komunikasi lagi gitu. Jadi memang berat, tapi kalau kita sudah punya passion Bapak Ibu, ini saya sedikit sharing Pak Singgih. Jadi kita menjadi dosen itu sebenarnya untuk apa gitu ya. Jadi kalau menurut akuntansi kan harus ada fit antara faktor internal dan eksternal. Jadi kalau saya Bapak Ibu itu simpel karena bapak saya almarhum guru, ibu saya almarhumah guru, kemudian sangat simpel saja gitu. Le esuk dadi guru ya le, ning nek esuk gurune mahasiswa. Kalau bisa jadi guru tapi gurunya mahasiswa yaitu dosen gitu. Kebetulan saya juga berminat jadi pengajar, jadi sejak kecil itu mulang ngaji, seneng mulang pokoknya gitu ya. Nah, kemudian ketemulah di situ. Jadi saya mengingatkan diri saya sendiri dan Bapak Ibu semua, dosen itu adalah pilihan, harus ada passion. Kalau dosen menjadi karir buangan, nah itu mungkin jadi masalah gitu. Kalau zaman saya dulu waktu S1 itu guyonnya ada dua, so nek lulus mau jadi apa gitu ya. Yang favorit itu dua, dosen FEB UGM dan di Bank Indonesia gitu lah. Guyonnya gitu lah, saya bisa jadi dosen. Karena saya jadi dosen sekarang bisa berkiprah juga di Bank Indonesia, menjadi komite akuntansinya, yang akuntansi syariah. Guyonnya gitu Pak Singgih. Ya, kalau dirasa berat, tapi insya Allah kalau kita punya passion dan semangat, dan saya ingatkan juga ini adik-adik saya terutama yang masih punya orang tua, yang adik saya itu masih muda orang tuanya, itu penting doa restu dari orang tua, kemudian doa dari para guru, ya, kemudian dari para sahabat itu karena penting. Saya kira itu Pak Singgih sementara.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Mahfud. Satu hal yang saya pelajari dari apa yang telah disampaikan dalam perspektif internasional, yaitu dari sisi bahwa ternyata kinerja sebagai mungkin posisi secara administrasi itu seringkali tidak sejalan, dan mereka juga tidak sejalan dengan karir depan ketika kita promosi sebagai akademisi, naik tingkat dari asisten ahli, lektor kepala, itu tidak ada hubungannya dengan posisi yang harus diemban untuk misalnya secara administrasi sebagai kaprodi atau sebagai wakil dekan. Ini apa yang sebenarnya harus dilakukan oleh para Bapak Ibu dosen, dalam artian bahwa haruskah peran itu diambil atau hanya berfokus pada satu peran yang lain. Kalau diambil keduanya mungkin tidak mudah, dan barangkali Pak Mahfud sekarang pada posisi itu bisa berbagi pada kita semua yang ada di sini. Terima kasih Pak Mahfud.
Baik Pak Singgih, ini saya juga bercerita semoga memotivasi, tidak ada niatan sombong insya Allah. Jadi saya kalau bahasa kerennya meniti karir gitu ya. Saya itu kan lulus 98, kuliah S1 saya 5 tahun Bapak Ibu. 98, kemudian tahun 2000 berangkat S2, ya 2000 saya ingat saya, atau 2001 saya lupa. 2000 mungkin bahasa Inggris 2001, lalu lulus 2002 akhirnya, berangkatnya 2001. Kemudian pulang itu menjadi sekretaris jurusan. Nah, zaman dulu sekretaris jurusan itu seperti dalam tanda petik tukang ngetik mengalokasikan dosen pembimbing skripsi dan lain sebagainya. Ya itu tapi saya nikmati gitu ya proses pembelajaran. Kemudian saya sempat juga menjadi ketua unit jaminan mutu waktu dari CSB itu. Pernah juga, yang mungkin banyak yang tidak tahu, menjadi ketua laboratorium bahasa FEB UGM gitu ya. Lalu menjadi ketua departemen, sekarang wakil dekan gitu. Ya itu memang fungsi administrasi yang mungkin tidak secara langsung gitu ya, berkaitan dengan karir kita. Tetapi saya yakin gitu, kalau saya pribadi melihatnya itu sebagai sebuah amanah, sebuah kepercayaan gitu ya dari teman-teman, dari senior kita, dari dosen kita, bapak-bapak kita, ya saya ambil menjalankan amanah itu dengan baik, gitu. Karena bisa jadi sebenarnya ya bapak-bapak kita, senior kita, ini dalam konteks UGM maupun di luar, itu sedang menguji kita gitu ya. Jadi kalau kita ini diberi tanggung jawab bagaimana gitu. Nah, ini sangat penting. Jadi sense of responsibility itu saya kira perlu dikaitkan. Kemudian memang kerja administratif ini menyita gitu. Tapi justru kalau saya pribadi, ya itu memotivasi saya bagaimana di tengah-tengah ya kesibukan sebagai administrator ini kita juga harus menunjukkan. Jadi ada rasa ya bahwa saya ini harus memberi contoh kepada yang lain ya. Alhamdulillah itu yang ditanamkan oleh orang tua dan guru saya. Kalau jadi misalnya ketua departemen ya harus memberi contoh gitu. Kalau dari wakil dekan ya alhamdulillah misalnya harus ada publikasi ya kita harus melakukan itu gitu. Saya kira kalau secara langsung mungkin tidak ada bahkan nambah berat, tapi secara tidak langsung sebenarnya itu mungkin bisa membantu dalam pencapaian karir kita, karena di situ dilatih juga soft skill kita, kemampuan manajerial kita gitu, dan ya alhamdulillah sampai sejauh ini saya bisa menjalani, semoga ya minta doa juga ke depannya tetap bisa kalau diberi amanat menjalankan dengan baik. Itu Pak Singgih.
Terima kasih Pak Mahfud. Saya lanjutkan, konteksnya agak sama, tetapi ini menjadi tambahan yang mungkin sebagian orang melihatnya sebagai sebuah beban, yang dalam kali ini adalah di mana profesi kita itu memang profesi akuntansi yang masih butuh banyak bantuan, kontribusi dari para akademisi atau dari praktisi untuk mengembangkan profesi kita. Dan di sini Pak Mahfud juga mengambil peran itu, membantu profesi dan duduk di DSAS sebagai ketua DSAS. Dan saya membayangkan itu posisi yang tidak hanya setting standar, tetapi kita tahu di dalam teori akuntansi, accounting standard itu ada political process, ada konsekuensi ekonomi, yang sehingga proses itu seringkali menyita pikiran, waktu, dan tenaga yang tidak sedikit, karena harus deal dengan mereka yang barangkali terdampak dari proses penyusunan standar akuntansi. Itu yang barangkali tidak mudah sebenarnya untuk dikelola, tetapi sampai saat ini Pak Mahfud diberikan amanah dan kepercayaan itu yang terus berjalan sampai sekarang. Monggo Pak Mahfud mungkin bisa berbagi dalam hal itu Pak Mahfud.
Terima kasih. Ini Pak Singgih mengingatkan pada buku yang saya baca sebelum saya berangkat master. Jadi saya lupa saat itu dipinjamin siapa ya Pak, siapa saya lupa. Judulnya adalah Political Process of Accounting Standard Setting gitu ya. Jadi saya membaca ternyata begitu dinamis, waktu itu konteksnya adalah Amerika ya, di Amerika gitu. Karena saya nggak membayangkan, saya tidak pernah punya cita-cita mau menjadi ketua Dewan Standar Akuntansi Syariah. Jadi alhamdulillah kalau untuk jabatan-jabatan ini saya tidak terlalu ambisi, tapi malah dikasih gitu. Betul Pak Singgih. Jadi waktu saya baca dulu itu membayangkan dinamikanya, dan ternyata sekarang saya mengalami gitu. Saya mengalami, belum lagi, mohon maaf kalau Pak Singgih di Dewan Standar Akuntansi Keuangan kan dunianya dunia akuntansi saja ya, dunianya hanya dunia. Saya itu ada dunia yang lain Pak gitu. Jadi para kiai ya, karena di anggota Dewan Standar itu ada dari Dewan Syariah Nasional, yaitu para kiai itu kadang saya harus menjelaskan akuntansi kepada beliau ya. Tetapi pada saat yang sama saya harus menjelaskan masalah syariah kepada teman-teman yang background-nya pure accounting gitu. Kemudian Pak Singgih saya kira juga mengalami di Dewan Standar itu ada perwakilan dari berbagai unsur, dari praktisi, kemudian regulator. Ya, itu memang sangat kentara ya, kentara bagaimana dinamikanya, ya untuk tidak mengatakan tarik ulur ya, dinamikanya sangat kentara. Tetapi ya alhamdulillah gitu ya, kita sebagai akademisi ya kita punya acuan ya di bidang akuntansi misalnya yang sudah kita pelajari. Kemudian kalau saya sebagai ketua Dewan Standar itu ya harus ngomong semuanya gitu. Jadi kalau saya sebagai ketua ya saya tampung semua dulu, tetapi jika sudah tiba saatnya ya saya mohon izin menggunakan hak saya sebagai yang punya hak suara juga, dan saya berkomentar. Tapi memang betul, ini saya juga mendorong nanti adik-adik yang atau bapak ibu yang lain, saya sering sampaikan juga bahwa menjadi Dewan Standar itu open position gitu ya, kan ada rekrutmen tuh. Saya kira bagus kalau nanti di antara Anda ada yang bergabung di sana, dan memang betul disampaikan Pak Singgih masih perlu banyak masukan dari akademisi atau dunia kampus. Kemarin terakhir misalnya saya ketemu dengan sahabat saya dari OJK yang juga anggota Dewan Standar, itu misalnya di bidang akuntansi syariah. Ini sekarang ada upaya mengembangkan transaksi istisna dan salam gitu. Kalau saya ke teman-teman industri itu biasanya sistemnya belum siap, termasuk sampai yang simpel penjurnalannya gitu. Nah, sehingga beliau itu pesan ke saya, Pak, kalau ada dosen muda atau asisten yang siap mendampingi tim saya gitu, mulai dari menyusunkan jurnalnya gitu, karena kalau standar kan global tuh, standar kan kita set standar, nanti detailnya kan harus ditindaklanjuti. Jadi memang masih diperlukan, betul Pak Singgih, jadi masih diperlukan dari dunia kampus untuk terlibat dalam pengembangan standar akuntansi, dan kita sebagai akademisi sebenarnya gitu kan punya satu konseptual framework sendiri yang harusnya kita bisa kita gunakan untuk membantu pengembangan standar tersebut. Begitu Pak Singgih.
Terima kasih Pak Mahfud. Selanjutnya ini masih saya coba lanjutkan dalam konteks ini. Dalam perspektif internasional tadi dikatakan salah satu poin penting adalah kemampuan untuk mensinergikan dari aktivitas yang barangkali 3 portofolio yang kalau dilaksanakan secara bersamaan itu sangat berat lah Pak Mahfud. Sekarang pada posisi yang juga saya kira dari karya itu merefleksikan portfolio yang ada, entah dari paten yang Pak Mahfud telah dapatkan atau bidang area yang Pak Mahfud telah miliki. Jurnalnya ada di bisnis etik, ada di wilayah syariah, karya bukunya, ada juga kemudian dalam konteks managerial accounting. Bagaimana ide sinergi itu juga barangkali sama dalam konteks di Indonesia, perlu juga kita memiliki pemikiran itu dan menerapkan sinergisitas dalam kita berkarya sebagai akademisi Pak Mahfud. Silakan Pak.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Singgih. Jadi ada 2 hal ya, sinergi, saya melihat tadi ada 2 hal. Satu, sinergi dalam tridharma, kemudian sinergi dalam tanda petik konsentrasi atau fokus riset kita gitu. Nah, dalam sinergi tridharma itu kan sebenarnya Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, kalau kita misalnya melakukan pengabdian masyarakat misalnya, itu kan sebenarnya bisa kita tulis menjadi sebuah artikel yang bisa kita publikasikan gitu. Begitu juga misalnya kita mengajar. Nah, kebetulan yang saya ceritakan kemarin accepted itu Pak Singgih itu dengan how to teach business ethics gitu. Jadi mengajar bisnis etik, kebetulan saya juga mengajar itu. Jadi dari pengalaman saya mengajar, misalnya lalu saya mendapatkan ide untuk saya teliti. Ya, dan alhamdulillah ini juga kolaborasi dengan teman dari UNY yang juga alumni kita sebenarnya ya. Jadi ini co-authorship 4 orang, tapi yang 3 itu ada bau UGM-nya gitu. Nah, jadi sinergi dalam arti tridharma itu bisa kita sinergikan. Pengabdian dan teaching itu bisa kita tulis menjadi sebuah published paper, dan alhamdulillah saya sudah membuktikan gitu ya. Kemudian terkait dengan sinergi dari sisi disiplin. Jadi kalau saya boleh bercerita, sebenarnya minat saya sejak S1 ya, bahkan itu adalah di bidang akuntansi manajemen. Alasannya simpel, karena saya selain membaca akuntansi juga senang baca buku-buku psikologi ya, dan saya kuliah itu waktu kuliah ternyata banyak dipakai, sehingga saya memutuskan untuk merencanakan kalau bidang ya minat itu di akuntansi manajemen. Lalu itu saya teruskan saat saya S2, kemudian saat S3 bidang saya itu. Lalu sebenarnya gitu, mengapa saya di bidang syariah, kalau boleh menyampaikan kebetulan ini juga takdir Allah, sejak SD, SMP, SMA sampai perguruan tinggi itu saya juga belajar agama gitu. Jadi di madrasah ibtidaiyah, Muhammadiyah, kemudian madrasah sanawiyah, kemudian madrasah aliyah gitu. Nah, sebenarnya sejak awal istri saya, karena kita kan suami tidak lepas dari istri, dukungan istri atau keluarga kan, sedang mengingatkan kenapa tidak konsentrasinya akuntansi syariah sejak awal gitu. Tapi saya bilang saya lebih senang ya akuntansi manajemen psikologi. Kemudian saya selesaikan dulu bidang itu, kemudian setelah pulang ya saya mulailah riset karena saya sudah punya basic, katakanlah begitu ya, pengetahuan agama, lalu alhamdulillah juga akuntansinya dapat. Lah itu saya melebar ke syariah. Kemudian salah satu bidang syariah yang penting juga itu adalah etika. Jadi mungkin kan etik itu kan tentang akhlak itu. Jadi ini sebenarnya bisa kita sinergikan gitu. Dan saya lihat misalnya banyak penelitian terkait dengan etika dikaitkan dengan akuntansi manajemen itu banyak juga. Gitu. Saya kira itu Pak Singgih. Jadi konteks sinerginya ada 2 hal, sinergi dalam tridharma, lalu sinergi dalam topik. Tentu saja dalam mengajar misalnya saya juga memakai artikel-artikel saya. Ya dilihat narsis ya enggak apa-apa, tapi kan kadang kita perlu mengajarkan kepada mahasiswa itu bagaimana melakukan riset. Misalnya saya ngajar metode penelitian, ya contohnya artikel saya, karena saya tahu betul apa yang saya lakukan gitu. Nah, termasuk terakhir kemarin saya minta artikelnya Pak Singgih untuk saya pakai mengajar. Selamat kepada Pak Singgih ya, sudah Q1 juga ya kemarin. Ya, gitu Pak Singgih, terima kasih.
Terima kasih Pak Mahfud. Saya masih menyimpan 2 pertanyaan utama dan waktunya saya kira masih cukup untuk itu. Yang pertama adalah bagaimana Pak Mahfud, sebenarnya mungkin salah satu keluhan secara kelembagaan adalah bahwa seringkali seseorang setelah mencapai level profesorship habis itu karyanya selesai, nggak berjalan lebih lanjut begitu. Ini barangkali audiens kita ini lebih banyak mungkin masih muda, tetapi barangkali cara pandang yang Pak Mahfud miliki bisa dibagikan kepada kami supaya dalam jangka panjang sebenarnya apa sih yang harus kemudian dipikirkan sebagai akademisi dan sehingga mungkin terefleksikan oleh karya Pak Mahfud yang terus bergulir meskipun telah mencapai profesorship-nya. Begini Pak Mahfud.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Singgih. Saya kira bagus ya. Pertanyaan Pak Singgih sangat mendasar ini. Pertanyaannya kan apakah profesorship itu sebenarnya sebagai akhir atau sebagai pemulaan gitu kan sebenarnya? Ya, kalau tadi disampaikan setelah profesor berhenti itu kan berarti profesor sebagai sebuah cita-cita gitu. Dan mohon maaf gitu, untuk mencapai itu kadang-kadang saya melihat ini ya banyak yang ini mohon maaf sekali lagi, untuk mencapai profesor itu dalam tanda petik mencari cara yang tidak elegan gitu. Nah, saya karena punya fakta gitu. Ya ini terjadi juga gitu. Kadang ada yang mohon maaf publikasinya tidak etis ya, mulai dari free rider gitu, kemudian sampai mohon maaf publikasi yang penting terindeks, yang penting internasional di jurnal yang tidak direkomendasikan atau kasarnya predatory jurnal. Dan itu saya sedih di level nasional. Kebetulan saya termasuk tim evaluator ya, tim evaluator kalau ke guru besar itu kadang-kadang sedih karena banyak yang bangga gitu ya publikasi internasional, padahal mohon maaf nih judulnya aja salah ketikannya gitu loh. Sehingga kalau saya evaluasi ya saya minta bukti korespondensinya gitu misalnya. Bukti korespondensi dikasih, ternyata korespondensi isinya adalah setelah mengirim artikel itu langsung diterima, kemudian langsung bayar $700, bayar $800, tidak ada feedback sama sekali. Nah, saya kira ini tidak bagus dan ini sudah menjadi mafia. Ini saya kira pesan yang perlu saya sampaikan kepada kolega saya, ini sudah ada mafia publikasi jurnal ya, publikasi artikel di jurnal internasional gitu. Bagi saya Pak Singgih, saya punya prinsip bahwa guru besar, profesor itu adalah sebuah awalan, sehingga saya masih harus terus berkarya. Kemudian kalau bahasa saya, kalau profesor itu kan ibaratnya sudah mentok nih karir akademik, meskipun saya masih 4B ya, saya belum 4E gitu, tapi jabatan saya sudah berhenti. Itu nanti kalau ke 4E, kalau saya gelinding saja sudah terpenuhi. Sekarang cita-cita saya, keinginan saya adalah bagaimana membantu ya kolega saya itu untuk bisa mencapai derajat profesor, kata hal itu dianggap sebuah yang baik kalau membantu mahasiswa, mahasiswi, kolega, sehingga saya sekarang open saja kalau ada yang mau kolaborasi riset, saya persilahkan misalnya begitu ya, karena tadi itu, jadi sudah agak berbeda tujuannya. Sekarang kalau boleh menggunakan istilah yang religius gitu, saatnya adalah menolong, membantu orang lain. Saya kira itu, jadi poin saya adalah profesor itu adalah hanya alat atau cara gitu untuk berkarir lebih lanjut, yaitu membantu orang lain, karena itu yang kita harus sekarang yang impactful, impact yang bisa kita lakukan secara personal, membantu yang junior, membantu kolega, membantu mahasiswa, lalu impact yang mungkin skala makro ya peran kita, karena dengan sudah ada embel-embel Prof ya, pakai F ya, bukan V, kalau V kan provokator ya, dulu saya pakai V, sekarang udah jadi F gitu ya, itu lebih lebih dalam tanda petik ya, lebih dihormati. Bukan penghormatannya yang kita cari, tapi bagaimana kita bisa berkontribusi gitu. Begitu Pak Singgih, terima kasih.
Terima kasih Pak Mahfud. Satu, saya kira pertanyaan yang sangat penting dan saya memperkirakan ini menjadi pertanyaan daripada audiens juga, yang kebetulan tadi Pak Mahfud telah menyebutkan posisi yang juga kemudian menjadi asesor penilaian untuk profesorship begitu. Dan dalam konteks pembahasan internasional tadi, tips dalam mengaplikasikan kenaikan pangkat juga menjadi satu isu yang kemudian diadres, harus tell the truth, story, itu sebuah storytelling, make the panel easy dalam mengakses. Barangkali ini juga menjadi pertanyaan, terutama dikaitkan mungkin keluhan apakah secara infrastruktur itu cukup baik pada kondisi saat ini, termasuk barangkali keluhan yang sering kali muncul ketika kalau dibilang infrastruktur, mungkin barangkali termasuk penilaian yang dilakukan oleh orang lain yang bukan di bidang minat kita di akuntansi dan berbagai isu terkait ini. Mohon Pak Mahfud untuk sharing mengenai tips saat dulu memasukkan aplikasi sampai kemudian berhasil dengan perolehan profesor dalam umur yang relatif muda. Demikian Pak Mahfud, saya kira itu pertanyaan terakhir saya sebelum kemudian kita nanti akan melihat pertanyaan dari para audiens. Monggo Pak Mahfud.
Terima kasih Pak Singgih. Ya ini Bapak Ibu semua, alhamdulillah ya kita yang di FEB UGM ini ada di Fakultas Ekonomika dan Bisnis UGM. Dan ini sering saya sampaikan kepada perguruan tinggi lain kalau saya mengisi gitu. Sebaiknya ada satu tim khusus ya di fakultas itu yang membantu administrasi gitu. Jadi kalau di tempat kita kan ada Pak Imam Muslih itu yang membantu administrasi. Jadi kalau di sini ada Bapak Ibu Dekan atau bahkan rektor perguruan tinggi lain, tolong ada satu tim yang didedikasikan khusus untuk mengurusi administrasi itu. Gitu. Itu pertama. Yang kedua, ya ini yang lebih penting juga. Tim administrasi itu ya tidak bisa bekerja kalau tidak ada karya ya kita setorkan gitu. Jadi itu juga dari kita. Misalnya saya sudah berkali-kali misalnya ke Pak Imam Muslih, Pak tolong dilihat ini. Mohon maaf ini Bapak Ibu, ya, diam-diam saya juga bergerilya, meskipun saya bukan Pak WD2, mohon maaf Pak WD2 kalau ada. Saya sering tanya ya, saya sudah lihat lama, ini kurang apa kok nggak naik-naik pangkat misalnya gitu. Kemudian dicarikan, oh syarat khususnya belum ada Pak, misalnya gitu. Nah itu di level fakultas perlu, kemudian di level individu juga perlu. Kalau di level negara, saya melihat sekarang jauh lebih mudah sebenarnya dalam arti sistemnya ya. Kalau dulu itu kan sering kita mendengar dokumennya ketelingsut gitu ya. Tapi kan sekarang sudah online. Ya sudah online gitu. Saya kira sangat transparan, bahkan komentar kita bahwa bahkan ada appeal gitu ya. Kemudian memang khusus akuntansi ini memang agak kurang asesornya. Oleh karena itu ya saya mendorong segera jadilah profesor gitu ya, yang dari akuntansi. Supaya nanti ajuan bidang akuntansi itu dievaluasi oleh akuntansi. Nah, karena kalau misalnya mohon maaf ini orang akuntansi dievaluasi oleh bidang lain mungkin tidak dapat sense-nya gitu. Tapi memang ada satu kalau nanti perlu kita pertimbangkan, sekarang itu kan untuk jadi syarat khusus ya guru besar itu ya, internasional berreputasi indeks minimal 0, berapa ya? 19 atau berapa gitu ya. Nah, cuman gitu ya, saya melihat juga ini ada tadi yang mafia itu kadang jurnalnya gitu misalnya baru 1 tahun kok sudah Q1, ini gimana ini? Nah itu juga harus kita perhatikan gitu. Jadi saya berpesan kepada saudara-saudaraku semua, tolong dalam memilih jurnal itu juga hati-hati. Meskipun Pak Singgih dan saya sudah bercerita juga, sama-sama Q1 itu ternyata beda ya. Ada yang Q1 3 bulan selesai, tapi ada yang 3 tahun gitu kan. Yang terakhir Pak Singgih itu kan hampir 2 tahun itu. Ya pengalaman saya British Counting Review itu juga ada yang hampir 2 tahun. Jadi ini yang terakhir ini, karena saya sedih kadang kalau dosen-dosen kita publikasi di jurnal gitu ya, terus bayarnya wakil tapi nggak ada proses review, karena itu nanti bisa meninggalkan dosa jariah kalau artikel kita salah dikutip, wah bahaya itu. Karena nggak ada proses review tadi. Jadi begitu Pak Singgih, infrastrukturnya mestinya memang bagus juga kalau Q1 pun itu dibedakan antara yang established journal gitu ya dengan yang sama-sama Q1 tetapi yang baru usianya 2 atau 3 tahun gitu. Ya tapi itu nanti saya yakin teman-teman kita di Jakarta akan terus melakukan perbaikan. Masa yang kayak gini aja masih belum banyak yang bisa lolos ya. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak Pak Mahfud. Terima kasih para partisipan yang setia sampai saat ini. Kita masih memiliki 164 partisipan dan saya yakin ada pertanyaan yang telah masuk. Mohon Mas Akbar untuk membantu menyajikan pertanyaan yang ada. Ada 3 pertanyaan ini Pak Mahfud. Yang pertama saya bacakan. Publikasi internasional merupakan salah satu syarat untuk meneliti jenjang karir di profesi dosen. Di tengah kesibukan yang Bapak lakukan, bagaimana mengatur waktu Bapak? Wah, ini penting sekali pertanyaan. Sekaligus yang kedua, coba menurut Bapak bagaimana peran Dewan Standar Syariah pada masa pandemi saat ini? Tentunya semakin berat. Bagaimana menurut Bapak? Ini mungkin bisa 2 yang terkait juga ini Pak Mahfud. Monggo Pak Mahfud.
Terima kasih ini Mbak Astuti, pertanyaannya bagus-bagus. Sejak tadi saya pantau beliau aktif ini. Jadi kalau ada award nanti Pak Singgih, ini layak menjadi mendapat partisipan award ini saya kira. Nah, karena pertanyaannya banyak dan bagus-bagus ya, tadi saya pantau. Jadi tadi saya ceritakan ya Bu Astuti dan Bapak Ibu sekalian, saya sudah memberi sinyal tadi. Saya cerita tadi jam 10 malam masih komunikasi dengan Pak Singgih, lalu tadi pagi jam berapa? 5:30, jam 5 kurang ya, habis subuh kita udah berkomunikasi lagi. Berarti tidurnya kan jam berapa gitu ya. Ya itu saya kira memang harus kita atur Bapak Ibu, kemudian apa namanya, ya kita harus berkorban, intinya begitu ya. Mohon maaf ini kalau Bapak Ibu terutama misalnya yang beragama Islam, saya kira ya layaklah bangun jam 3 pagi gitu ya, gitu. Itu mengatur waktu memang tantangan tersendiri, tetapi kebetulan saya dulu itu mondok 6 tahun itu salah satu mahfuzat ya, yang dipelesetkan Pak Bambang Dibyoman jadi mahfudhot itu ada khairu jalisin fi zamanil kitab itu. Jadi saya diajari kemana-mana bawa buku, bawa bacaan. Nah kalau sekarang mungkin bawa handphone gitu ya. Mohon maaf ini sambil ke belakang itu mungkin buka handphone gitu, yang isinya adalah artikel gitu. Guyonnya kan begitu. Tapi memang tantangan untuk mengatur waktu, tapi saya yakin bisa. Semua itu kalau ada niat insya Allah bisa. Cuman pesan saya satu juga Bapak Ibu, bagi yang sudah keluarga, ini mungkin juga perlu minta pengertian dari para ahli keluarga ya, baik suami istri atau anak gitu. Karena kadang-kadang ya pengalaman saya juga mengurangi waktu untuk istri dan anak, tapi ya kita beri pengertian. Dan alhamdulillah sampai sekarang kami bahagia ya, kami berenam ya, 1 istri anak 4 itu. Menurut Bapak peran, ya betul sekarang ini kan semua bisnis terpengaruh ya dengan pandemi. Dan yang unik kan pandemi ini yang terserang itu adalah orangnya gitu loh, bukan bisnisnya gitu. Kalau yang terserang itu bisnisnya kan mungkin bisa kita atasi relatif lebih mudah. 98 atau 2008, tapi itu yang kena orangnya gitu. Jadi memang berat. Kemudian peran Dewan Standar Akuntansi khususnya Syariah saya kira sama dengan Pak Singgih ya, kita mencoba membantu bangkit, kemudian kita sudah mengeluarkan beberapa kebijakan ya itu ya. Kita lakukan beberapa press release dan lain sebagainya. Saya kira itu Pak Singgih.
Baik, dari Bu Erni dan ada satu lagi yang terakhir nanti sangat menarik pertanyaannya, tapi dari Bu Erni dulu. Ini izin Prof, tantangan apa yang paling berat dihadapi saat mengajar dan membimbing mahasiswa? Ini tips yang harus diberikan karena di tengah kehidupan itu juga menantang untuk kemudian memberikan bimbingan, membaca hasil karya, memotivasi mahasiswa dan seterusnya. Monggo Pak Mahfud.
Iya. Jadi kalau dalam mengajar itu ya memang tantangannya bagaimana memahamkan, tapi tidak hanya itu ya, sebenarnya kalau kita mengajar itu saya lebih sepakat dengan teaching student atau learning how to learn, itu juga penting gitu. Jadi tantangannya misalnya kalau kita mengajar kebetulan di akuntansi misalnya sebagian besar ya, di UGM ini berbahasa Inggris ya, berarti kan mahasiswa harus diajari yang sederhana bagaimana cara membaca, misalnya yang krusial itu ya. Kemudian disampaikan maknanya, karena sering juga mahasiswa salah arti, itu menyebabkan salah pemahaman. Kemudian pemahaman yang lain, tantangan yang lain kalau saat mengajar itu adalah bagaimana memotivasi mahasiswa mau membaca. Itu penting karena kalau saya sering bilang di kelas, ini yang belajar itu Anda ya, saya bilang gitu. Karena saya dalam rangka memotivasi ini yang belajar Anda, maka Anda yang harus lebih aktif daripada saya gitu. Kalau saya bilang misalnya saya mengajar etika sudah sejak tahun 2003. Saya sudah hafal bahkan isi bukunya misalnya begitu. Tapi Anda baru sekali gitu. Itu dalam mengajar, kemudian dalam membimbing ini membimbing tesis atau membimbing kehidupan ini?
Dua-duanya nih. Ini lebih kepada
ya,
tesis.
kalau dalam membimbing tesis itu memang saya kira sama tadi disampaikan ya, kalau kita publikasi itu kan harus menjelaskan juga apa sih kontribusi gitu ya, lalu tesis atau skripsi atau disertasi itu arahnya mau kemana gitu. Nah, cuman apa namanya, ini kan juga mahasiswa kita itu variatif ya Bapak Ibu ya, Bapak Ibu semua di UGM pun juga variatif, sehingga kita harus membimbing itu apa namanya harus sabar gitu. Nah, misalnya kalau saya kadang bentuk kesabaran saya adalah bentuk ancaman gitu. Jadi misalnya saya punya prinsip first repeat test gitu. Jadi saya baca 3 halaman, kalau banyak salah saya kembalikan, saya suruh Mbak memperbaiki lagi. Tapi saya juga punya tips, nanti mungkin Bapak Ibu juga bisa meniru. Kalau saya membimbing itu saya tanya dulu mahasiswa, baik eksplisit maupun tidak, apakah sekedar mau menyelesaikan skripsi, tesis, disertasi, atau punya target lebih. Target lebih itu misalnya ikut conference nasional, internasional, atau bahkan pengen publikasi gitu ya. Karena ini kita penting untuk set up waktu kita gitu. Jadi kalau mahasiswa hanya pengen lulus ya sudah, nggak usah serius-serius bimbingnya, yang penting memenuhi standar gitu. Pak Singgih dan saya punya pengalaman juga itu membimbing anak S1, karena hidup pun tidak bersemangat apalagi menulis tesis gitu kan. Yang penting kan keluar dari FEB masih hidup dan selesai gitu kan. Tetapi kalau misalnya ini ada ini mahasiswa yang tipenya itu bahkan S1 sekarang ya beberapa jadi dosen kita itu ya. Dia tidak hanya ingin lulus skripsi tetapi ingin publikasi. Sehingga ada juga bimbingan saya misalnya yang skripsinya dalam bahasa Inggris. Ya kalau memang minatnya begitu, jadi ini saya kira contingency fit antara kita dan mahasiswa juga perlu. Langsung kalau yang terakhir Pak Singgih ya.
Terakhir ini nggak mudah dijawab karena Bapak seorang bapak-bapak, ini pertanyaannya dari sisi ibu yang berkarir sebagai dosen. Barangkali tantangannya berbeda, tapi mungkin bisa dari sisi apa yang bisa diberikan. Saya juga tidak punya ide mengenai hal ini, Pak Mahfud.
Ya, kalau saya simpel Pak Singgih, hidup itu adalah pilihan, ya. Bahwa mohon maaf ini ya ibu-ibu ya, bahwa Anda sebagai istri, sebagai dosen itu kan pilihan. Prinsip saya, begitu you punya pilihan, you have to be responsible. Gitu ya. Ya, Anda harus responsible dong. Nah, kalau sebagai istri memang Anda harus taat sama suami kan. Tetapi kalau Anda sebagai dosen ya harus komitmen. Sehingga misalnya, ini termasuk istri saya dulu kan dosen, tapi saya merasa gitu ya kayaknya lebih baik kamu mengajari saya dan anak-anak kita aja dah gitu. Ya, sehingga dia sekarang nggak dosen, tapi cerdas juga dia ya, nggak jadi dosen tapi ibu profesor. Karena bapak dan ibu Profesor Mahfud Sholihin gitu ya. Jadi sesuai namanya ya, cerdas gitu ya, nggak usah sekolah S3, nggak usah jadi ibu profesor. Saya kira itu Pak Singgih, jadi prinsipnya harus responsible. Ya, kalau sekali Anda memilih jadi dosen, ya mestinya kewajiban itu Anda penuhi. Kalau memang tidak, ya saya mungkin bahasa saya terlalu sarkastik gitu, ya keluar aja, karena kasihan dosen yang lain, sama-sama dosen perempuan misalnya ya. Ada yang mau ditugasi ini jatuh langganan pekerjaan, tapi dengan alasan ibu rumah tangga gitu ya misalnya, terus nggak mau, itu kan kasihan temannya, itu menzolimi temannya saya kira. Nah itu yang urusan kantor, kalau urusan rumah kan selesaikan dengan suami masing-masing. Saya nggak mau mencampuri rumah tangga dah, tapi be responsible. Terima kasih Pak Singgih. Ada lagi?
Masih satu yang terakhir Prof, dan secara waktu pas bila Bapak bisa merespon ini dalam waktu sekitar 3 menit barangkali Pak Mahfud.
Oke. Terima kasih. Apakah lulus master bisa langsung mengajar? Peraturan di tingkat nasional masih membolehkan mengajar, tapi hanya S1. Nah, gitu. Kemudian apakah langsung melanjutkan doktor? Nah, ini saya ingat. Sejarah saya lulus 98 jadi dosen, kemudian tahun 99 akhir atau 2000, saya kira saat itu saya ditawari menjadi asisten dosen kita, bapak kita, merancang ABC per bulannya dibayar 10 juta katanya saat itu tahun 2000. Tetapi saya ingat cerita kakek saya gitu ya, cerita Nabi Sulaiman, ya, Nabi Sulaiman akhirnya milih ilmu dan dapat semuanya. Nah, sekarang insya Allah cari uang 10 juta satu bulan tidak terlalu sulit. Nah, mungkin sulit sekali ya, itu enggak tahu ya. Jadi kalau saran saya, sebaiknya kalau ada kesempatan Anda sekolah. Jadi alhamdulillah lingkungan saya di FEB UGM, guru-guru saya itu sangat perhatian. Jadi saya sangat ingat ya pesan almarhum Pak Nur Indriantoro, saya jadi dosen langsung didatangi, diceramahin berapa itu 3 jam kalau ya di ruang Q itu, kapan kamu sekolah? Saya jawab, insya Allah 2 tahun lagi doakan. Alhamdulillah berangkat. Pulang master, saya ingat Pak Suarjono berpesan dalam satu kesempatan sebisa mungkin sebelum 5 tahun you lulus master harus sudah S3. Ya alhamdulillah. Saya lulus 2002, 2006 sudah berangkat. Jadi saya sarankan Anda untuk langsung dokter. FEB pun sekarang rekrut dosen hanya yang dokter, tahun ini ya. Kemudian kalau membagi keduanya ini mungkin sekolah sambil sekolah sekolah S3 sambil mengajar, ya pandai-pandailah membagi waktu, komunikasi dengan pimpinan. Saya kira itu pesan saya Pak Singgih. Terima kasih, mohon maaf Bapak Ibu kalau ada kata yang kurang berkenan di hati Bapak Ibu semuanya.
Terima kasih banyak Pak Mahfud Sholihin atas berbagi pengalaman, tips dan kata-kata bijaknya kepada kita semua. Semoga ini memberikan manfaat bagi para partisipan dan kita semua yang telah mendengarkan pengalaman dan berbaginya dari Profesor Mahfud Sholihin. Barakallah. Saya kembalikan kepada Bu Amanda. Terima kasih Bu Amanda.